England, 1829. The morning mist clung to the cobblestones of Mayfair like a shroud as Adrian Blackwell, Duke of Ashbourne, stared at the letter trembling in his hands. The paper was yellowed and creased, smuggled through channels he dared not contemplate, bearing a seal he recognized with a jolt that traveled from his chest to his fingertips. The Harrowfield crest, once proudly displayed across London's grandest ballrooms, now appeared faded and desperate, pressed into wax that had cracked during its clandestine journey. His butler had presented it without ceremony an hour before dawn, the old servant's eyes conveying what propriety forbade his lips to speak. Someone had risked everything to deliver this message. Adrian had dismissed him immediately, retreating to his study where shadows still pooled in the corners, and the fire had long since died to embers. Now, as pale light began filtering through the heavy curtains, he read the words again, each sentence striking him like a physical blow. The handwriting was unfamiliar, crude even, formed by hands more accustomed to labor than correspondence. But the message it carried made his blood run cold and hot simultaneously, a sensation he had not experienced since that terrible morning, 11 months ago, when he had arrived at the Harrowfield townhouse to find it shuttered and abandoned. His beloved Eveline vanished as thoroughly as morning dew beneath an unforgiving sun. "Your Grace," the letter began, the formality at odds with the urgency bleeding through every word, "I write to you at great peril, knowing that discovery means my death, but conscience allows me no other course. The lady you sought, Lady Eveline Harrowfield, did not abandon you by choice, nor did she wed another as London's gossips claim with such certainty. She is held, Your Grace, held as surely as any prisoner in Newgate, though her chains are invisible and her captors wear the masks of respectability." Adrian's jaw clenched as he continued reading, his free hand gripping the arm of his leather chair until his knuckles whitened. The letter detailed a conspiracy that made his stomach turn, a web of coercion and corruption spun by the Earl of Ravensmore, that ambitious serpent who had been circling the edges of Parliament's power for years. The Earl had manufactured debts that did not exist, produced documents that bore forged signatures, and wielded threats that left Lord Harrowfield, Eveline's father, with impossible choices. Pay fabricated sums that would bankrupt the family entirely, or flee London's scrutiny and live under Ravensmore's shadow in the frozen reaches of Northumberland, where the Earl's influence ran deep and his word was law. The Harrowfields had chosen survival over honor, or perhaps they had simply chosen to protect their daughter from something worse. The letter did not specify what Ravensmore truly wanted, but Adrian could guess. Political alliances were forged through marriage, and Eveline's bloodline, though her family's coffers were emptied, still carried weight among the old nobility. "She thinks of you daily, Your Grace," the letter continued, and these words pierced Adrian more deeply than all the rest. "I have served in this household since before Lady Eveline's birth, and never have I seen her spirit so diminished. She believes you have forgotten her, that you accepted the rumors without question, that your heart proved as fickle as London's weather. She does not know I write to you. If she did, she would forbid it, convinced that involving you would only invite your destruction as well." The letter was signed simply, "Thomas Webb, faithful servant," followed by crude directions to an estate called Greystone Manor, tucked so far into Northumberland's wilderness that Adrian had to consult 3 separate maps before locating it. The place sat near the Scottish border, surrounded by moorland and isolated villages where strangers were noticed and reported, where Ravensmore's men could move freely, while any rescue attempt would be observed from miles away. Adrian stood abruptly, the chair scraping against polished wood, and moved to the window. Beyond the glass, London was awakening. Merchants were opening their shops, servants were hurrying through morning errands, and society was preparing for another day of carefully orchestrated frivolity. None of them knew that his world had just inverted itself, that the woman he had mourned as lost was alive and suffering, that every rumor he had forced himself to believe was a lie constructed by a man who collected power like other men collected snuff boxes. He had tried to move forward. God knew he had tried. His mother had paraded eligible young women through endless dinner parties, each one accomplished and beautiful and utterly wrong. His friends had encouraged him to take a mistress, to lose himself in cards and racing and the usual pursuits that occupied men of his station. He had gone through the motions, attending Parliament sessions and managing his estates with mechanical efficiency, but his heart had remained stubbornly fixed on a memory of dark eyes that sparkled with intelligence, of a laugh that transformed drawing rooms into places of genuine warmth, of conversations that stretched past midnight, because neither of them could bear to say goodnight. Eveline had been different from the practiced debutantes who simpered and schemed their way through London seasons. She possessed a sharp wit that she wielded like a fencer's blade, quick and precise, never cruel but always honest. She read philosophy and argued politics with a passion that both scandalized and delighted him. She rode like a woman possessed, caring nothing for side-saddle propriety when she thought no one was watching. She had challenged him, matched him, and ultimately claimed his heart so completely that 11 months of absence had not diminished his love by even a fraction. Their courtship had been conducted largely in secret, stolen moments in gardens during balls, carefully orchestrated encounters during morning rides in Hyde Park. Letters passed through trusted intermediaries. Her father had not forbidden their attachment, but neither had he encouraged it. Lord Harrowfield had seemed perpetually distracted during that season, his face drawn with worries that Adrian now understood had nothing to do with his daughter's romantic prospects and everything to do with the net closing around his family. The disappearance had been shockingly sudden. One day Eveline had been laughing at his side during a Venetian breakfast at the Thornbury estate. The next, her family's townhouse stood empty, servants dismissed, furniture covered in dustcloths. No one claimed to know where they had gone. The few relatives questioned professed ignorance or offered vague mentions of financial difficulties requiring discretion. Within a week, the rumors had started. Lady Eveline had eloped with a country gentleman. Lady Eveline had been secretly engaged all along. Lady Eveline had never truly cared for the Duke of Ashworth, who everyone knew was far too serious for such a spirited girl. Adrian had investigated, of course. He had hired men who asked questions in the right places, but they had found nothing conclusive, only whispers and speculation. Eventually his mother had urged him to let it go, to accept that some mysteries had no satisfying answers, and that prolonging his pursuit would only damage his reputation and political prospects. He had acquiesced, though his surrender was more about protecting Eveline's name than preserving his own comfort. If she had truly wished to escape him, he would not force his presence into her new life. That was what he had told himself, repeated like a prayer during sleepless nights. Now he knew better. She had not escaped. She had been taken. The distinction mattered more than words could express. Adrian turned from the window and moved to his desk, pulling out fresh paper and ink. His hands were steady now, purpose replacing shock. He composed 3 letters in rapid succession. The first went to his steward, instructing him to prepare for an extended absence, and to manage the estate's affairs independently. The second went to his solicitor, a discreet man who had served his family for decades, requesting a full investigation into the Earl of Ravensmoor's financial dealings and political connections, along with instructions to do so without alerting the Earl or his allies. The third letter was the most difficult. He addressed it to his mother, the Dowager Duchess. Knowing her response would be swift and disapproving, she would invoke duty, propriety, and the dangers of acting rashly. She would remind him that chasing after a woman who had vanished under mysterious circumstances could damage everything their family had built. But Adrian was past caring about such considerations. He wrote with honesty, explaining that he was pursuing a matter of honor and that he would return when circumstances allowed. He did not mention Eveline by name, but his mother would understand. She always understood, even when she disapproved. By the time his valet arrived to help him dress, Adrian had already packed a traveling bag with essentials and was studying his maps of northern England. The journey to Northumberland would take at least 4 days by horse, possibly longer depending on weather and road conditions. He would need to travel quickly but not conspicuously, avoiding main routes where Ravensmoor's men might be watching. Thomas Webb's letter had made one thing abundantly clear. The Earl maintained surveillance over anyone approaching Greystone Manor, and any obvious rescue attempt would be detected and thwarted before it could succeed. His valet Patterson was a man of few words and absolute loyalty, qualities that had served Adrian well during his years in the army, before inheriting the dukedom. Patterson took one look at the maps and the packed bag and simply nodded, moving to select appropriate clothing for a journey that would take them far from London's comforts. Heavy coats, sturdy boots, nothing that would mark them as aristocracy moving through the countryside. They would travel as gentlemen of moderate means, perhaps land stewards or solicitors on business, unremarkable and easily overlooked. "Will you be needing company, Your Grace?" Patterson asked quietly as he folded a thick wool coat. Adrian considered the question. Part of him wanted to refuse, to face whatever waited in Northumberland alone rather than risk anyone else's safety. But practicality won out. He would need someone to manage logistics, to serve as an extra set of eyes to help if things went badly. Patterson had been with him through military campaigns where death lurked around every corner. The man could handle himself in a fight and possessed the kind of calm pragmatism that proved invaluable during crises. "Yes," Adrian replied. "We leave within the hour. Tell the stablemaster to prepare Zeus and your mount. We'll purchase additional horses along the way and change them frequently. Speed matters, but so does discretion." Patterson nodded again and departed to make arrangements. Adrian returned to the letter, reading it one final time before locking it in his desk's hidden drawer. He committed every detail to memory: the location of Greystone Manor, the description of Ravensmoor's men who patrolled the estate's perimeter, the mention of a village called Ashwick 3 miles to the south where supplies could be obtained and information might be gathered. Thomas Webb had been thorough despite the obvious danger he faced in writing at all. The question of why the servant had risked everything to contact him nagged at Adrian's mind. Webb's letter mentioned witnessing the forbidden love between you both, suggesting he had somehow observed Adrian and Eveline during their secret courtship. Perhaps he had been the intermediary who delivered their letters, or maybe he had simply noticed what others missed: the way Eveline's face transformed when Adrian entered a room, the careful way they positioned themselves during social gatherings to steal moments of conversation, the profound sadness that had settled over her in the days before her family's disappearance. Whatever Webb's motivation, Adrian owed him a debt that could never be fully repaid. Without this letter, he might have spent the rest of his life believing Eveline had chosen to leave him, that their connection had been one-sided or insufficient to overcome whatever obstacles had driven her away. The truth, though darker than he could have imagined, at least gave him purpose and direction. She had not abandoned him. She was trapped, and he would free her. The clock on the mantel chimed 7 times as Adrian descended the stairs, his travelling coat already buttoned against the morning chill. His townhouse staff moved quietly around him, well trained enough not to ask questions about his sudden departure. His mother would receive her letter by mid-morning and would undoubtedly dispatch her own correspondence demanding explanations, but by then he would be miles away, beyond the reach of her objections. Zeus was waiting in the mews, the massive black stallion stamping impatiently as a groom checked his tack. Adrian had purchased the horse 5 years earlier from a breeder in Ireland, drawn by the animal's unusual combination of size, speed, and intelligence. Zeus had carried him through countless morning rides and had proven himself during a harrowing journey through a Welsh storm 2 winters past. If any horse could handle the demanding journey north, it was this one. Patterson emerged from the stable leading his own mount, a sturdy bay gelding named Ranger. The valet had changed into travelling clothes that made him look like a prosperous merchant's assistant rather than a duke's personal servant. Adrian approved. They needed to blend into the landscape, to become forgettable faces among the thousands of people moving through England's roads for business or family matters. "Everything is prepared, Your Grace," Patterson said, securing his own pack behind his saddle. "I took the liberty of including medical supplies and additional ammunition for your pistols. If we're riding into the situation described in that letter, we should be prepared for trouble." Adrian mounted Zeus in one smooth motion, gathering the reins as the horse danced sideways, eager to run. "Your foresight is appreciated, Patterson. We'll take the western route out of London, then head north through Oxford and Leicester. I want to avoid the main coaching roads where possible. Ravensmoor has eyes everywhere, and I'd prefer not to announce our destination." They rode out of Mayfair as the city continued its morning awakening, joining the flow of traffic heading toward the western gates. No one paid particular attention to two well-dressed gentlemen on fine horses. Such sights were common enough in London's fashionable districts. But once they cleared the city's outskirts and entered the countryside beyond, Adrian allowed Zeus to stretch into a ground-eating canter, eating up miles with a rhythm that matched the urgency pounding in his chest. The English countryside rolled past in shades of green and gold, autumn painting the landscape with the colors of transformation. They passed through villages where curious faces tracked their progress, but asked no questions, stopped at inns that provided fresh horses and hot meals without prying into their business. Adrian kept their conversations with locals brief and unremarkable, playing the role of a land agent traveling north to inspect properties for a client. The story was boring enough to discourage follow-up questions while explaining their purposeful pace. Each mile brought him closer to Eveline, but also deeper into Ravensmoor's territory. The Earl's influence grew as they moved north, his name appearing more frequently in conversations overheard in tavern common rooms. Here he had invested in coal mines that enriched him while impoverishing the workers. There he owned farmland that he rented at exorbitant rates. Everywhere, it seemed, Ravensmoor's reach extended, his wealth and power creating webs of dependence and fear. On the third day, as they approached the border between Yorkshire and Northumberland, Adrian began to understand the full scope of what he was attempting. Ravensmoor had essentially created a personal fiefdom in these northern reaches, using economic leverage and strategic marriages to build a network of allies and dependents who would protect his interests without question. Riding openly to Greystone Manor and demanding Eveline's release would accomplish nothing except alerting the Earl to Adrian's presence and intentions. He needed a better strategy, one that accounted for the power imbalance and the isolation of Eveline's prison. They stopped for the night at an inn called the Broken Wheel, a weathered establishment that sat at a crossroads between several small villages. The common room was crowded with local farmers and traveling merchants, their conversations providing a wealth of information for anyone willing to listen. Adrian positioned himself at a corner table with a pint of ale and open ears, while Patterson made friends with the stable boys who always knew more about local affairs than they were given credit for. The talk inevitably turned to Greystone Manor and its mysterious residents. The Harrowfield family had arrived nearly a year ago, moving into what had been an abandoned estate that Ravensmoor had purchased and hastily renovated. They kept to themselves, venturing out only occasionally for supplies, always accompanied by the Earl's men. The daughter, people whispered, was beautiful but sad, her eyes carrying the weight of unspoken sorrows. Her father seemed diminished, a shadow of whatever he had been before, while her mother rarely appeared at all. "'Tis not right keeping them there like prisoners," an old farmer muttered into his drink, his words slurred by ale and bitterness. "But Ravensmoor owns half the magistrates and all the constables. Who's to stop him? He says they owe him money, that they're living at Greystone as his guests until the debt is settled. But I've seen debtors before, and these folk look more like captives to me." His companion, a younger man with the broad shoulders of a blacksmith, nodded agreement. "My cousin works in the manor's kitchens. Says there are guards everywhere, that the family can't leave the grounds without permission. Says the daughter tried to run once, made it as far as the village before they caught her and dragged her back. Hasn't tried since, but you can see it in her face when she comes to town. She's trapped well and truly." Adrian's grip on his tankard tightened until he feared the vessel might shatter. Eveline had tried to escape. She had fought against her captivity, which meant her spirit had not been entirely crushed by circumstances. The knowledge gave him hope, even as it fueled his rage against the man who had orchestrated this imprisonment. When Patterson returned from the stables, his expression was grim. "The stablemaster's son works at Greystone Manor in the mornings, Your Grace. He confirms what you're hearing. Heavy guard presence, especially at night. The Earl visits frequently, staying for days at a time. During his visits, the family is restricted to specific rooms and monitored constantly. The boy says there are rumors Ravensmoor is trying to force a marriage between himself and Lady Eveline, but she keeps refusing. Each refusal makes him angrier." The words confirmed Adrian's worst fears. Ravensmoor wanted Eveline for himself, coveted her bloodline, and whatever political advantages a marriage to the Harrowfield name would provide. He had isolated her family, stripped them of resources and options, and was systematically breaking down her resistance through time and pressure. How long could anyone hold out against such sustained coercion? How long before desperation or misguided protectiveness toward her parents forced Eveline into accepting the unacceptable? "We need to move quickly," Adrian said quietly, pitching his voice below the tavern's ambient noise. "But we also need intelligence. I want to know Greystone's layout, guard rotations, where the family sleeps, which routes in and out are least monitored. Can your stablemaster's son be trusted?" Patterson considered the question carefully. For the right price and assurances of protection afterward, yes. The boy has no love for Ravensmoor's operation. His sister was dismissed from the manor without pay after she objected to how the Harrowfields were being treated. He might help us if we approach it correctly. "Arrange a meeting," Adrian decided. "Tomorrow, somewhere private. Offer him enough money to leave this area entirely once this is over. Ravensmoor will know someone provided information, and anyone associated with the manor will be suspect. The boy deserves compensation and safety for taking that risk." They spent another hour in the common room, gathering what information they could from overheard conversations and carefully casual questions. By the time they retired to their rented room, Adrian had begun forming a plan. It would be dangerous, required precise timing, and offered no guarantees of success. But doing nothing was not an option. Every day Eveline remained at Greystone was another day Ravensmoor tightened his control, another opportunity for her circumstances to worsen in ways Adrian preferred not to imagine. He lay awake long after Patterson's breathing had settled into sleep's steady rhythm, staring at the ceiling's rough wooden beams and thinking of Eveline. Did she know he had searched for her? Did she believe the rumors that he had moved on, accepted her disappearance as society expected? Or did some part of her still hope, still trust that what they had shared was real and lasting? Thomas Webb's letter suggested she thought herself forgotten, abandoned, to face her nightmare alone. The idea that she might believe he had given up on their love hurt worse than any physical wound. Tomorrow he would meet with the stablemaster's son and gather the intelligence needed to plan a rescue. Then he would scout Greystone's perimeter himself, map its vulnerabilities, and identify the best approach. He would need to act before Ravensmoor's next visit, which according to the tavern gossip was expected within the week. Once the Earl arrived, security would tighten further and opportunities would vanish. Adrian allowed himself to remember the last time he had held Eveline, a stolen moment in the Thornbury garden during that Venetian breakfast that now seemed to have occurred in another lifetime. She had been wearing a pale blue dress that matched her eyes, her dark hair artfully arranged, but already escaping its pins in the way that always made him smile. They had walked among the roses, speaking of future plans they had barely dared to voice, dreams of a life built together once he had secured her father's formal blessing and arranged a proper courtship that would satisfy society's expectations. "I love you," she had whispered against his shoulder, the words barely audible above the garden's ambient sounds. "Whatever happens, remember that I love you. Nothing will change that." He had kissed her then, a brief but fierce connection that had promised everything they could not yet speak aloud. When they returned to the party, her cheeks had been flushed and his cravat had been slightly askew, earning knowing looks from friends who were kind enough not to comment. It had been perfect and private and theirs. 2 days later she was gone. Now, finally, he understood why. Now he could act instead of merely grieving. The knowledge burned through him like fire, consuming doubt and hesitation, leaving only determination. He would reach Greystone Manor. He would find Eveline. He would break Ravensmoor's hold on her family and restore what the Earl had tried to steal. And if the Earl of Ravensmoor stood in his way, Adrian would remove him with whatever force proved necessary. He had killed men during his military service, defending his country and his comrades. He would have no hesitation about eliminating someone who had orchestrated such calculated cruelty against innocents. Let London society gasp and gossip. Let his mother despair of his reputation. Some things mattered more than propriety, and Eveline's freedom topped that list. Dawn arrived too slowly and too quickly simultaneously, painting the sky in shades of rose and gold that seemed obscenely beautiful given the darkness of his mission. Adrian rose, dressed, and prepared himself mentally for the day ahead. Every step forward brought him closer to either triumph or disaster, and he could not afford to misstep. Patterson was already awake, having arranged a meeting with the stablemaster's son in a disused barn at the edge of the village. They walked there through morning mist, their boots crunching on frost-touched grass, two figures moving with purpose through a landscape that seemed oblivious to human drama. The boy was waiting, nervous but determined, his hands shoved deep in his pockets and his eyes constantly scanning for observers. He could not have been more than 16, with the gangly awkwardness of youth not quite finished transforming into manhood, but his gaze held a sharpness that spoke of intelligence and observation skills beyond his years. "You're asking about Greystone Manor," the boy said without preamble once Patterson had made introductions. "My master said you're willing to pay for information and help me and mine leave this area afterward. That true?" "It is," Adrian confirmed, keeping his voice gentle but firm. "What you tell us today could help right a terrible wrong, but it will also put you at risk, which is why I'm prepared to provide both immediate payment and ongoing support. You have my word as a gentleman and a duke." The boy's eyes widened slightly at the mention of Adrian's title, but he did not back away. Instead, he squared his shoulders as if accepting a burden he had been preparing to carry. "Then I'll tell you what I know, Your Grace, and God help us all if Ravensmoor discovers this conversation." The barn's interior smelled of old hay and weathered wood, dust motes dancing in the thin streams of morning light that pierced through gaps in the walls. Adrian leaned against a support beam, every sense focused on the stable boy who stood before them, his nervousness evident in the way his fingers worried at a loose thread on his coat sleeve. Patterson had positioned himself near the door, keeping watch for anyone who might interrupt this clandestine meeting. "My name's William Thorne," the boy began, his voice steadying as he committed to his course. "I work mornings at Greystone, mucking stables and tending the horses. Been there since Ravensmoor reopened the place last winter. The Earl don't pay much mind to servants, thinks we're invisible or stupid or both. Makes him careless with his words when we're about." Adrian nodded encouragingly, pulling out a small leather pouch heavy with coins and setting it on a barrel between them. William's eyes tracked the movement, but he did not reach for the money, which spoke well of his character. He wanted to finish his story first, to earn what was being offered rather than simply take and run. "The manor's built in an old style, Your Grace, all stone and thick walls. Main house has 3 floors plus cellars. The Harrowfield family is kept on the 2nd floor east wing. Lord Harrowfield has 1 room, his lady wife another, and Lady Eveline a 3rd. All the doors have locks on the outside, though they're not always engaged during daylight hours when the guards are present. At night they're locked tight, everyone." The image William painted made Adrian's jaw clench. Eveline sleeping behind a locked door, treated like a criminal in her own supposed sanctuary. The violation of it, the systematic stripping of dignity and freedom, fed the cold rage building in his chest. "How many guards?" he asked, keeping his voice level despite the emotions churning beneath. "Depends on whether the Earl's in residence," William replied. "When he's away, there's usually 6 men on the grounds. 4 patrol outside in shifts, 2 stay inside near the family's wing. When Ravensmoor visits, that number doubles. He brings his own men from London, rough types who look more like criminals than proper guards. They drink heavy in the evenings, which makes them mean but also less attentive as the night wears on." Patterson spoke up from his position by the door. "What about servants who live on the property? How loyal are they to Ravensmoor?" William's expression grew complicated. "Mixed, sir. Some are locals who need the work and keep their heads down, don't ask questions, just do their duties and collect their wages. Others were brought in by the Earl, people with questionable pasts who owe him favors or fear him too much to disobey. The housekeeper, Mrs. Blackwood, she's one of Ravensmoor's creatures through and through. Watches the family like a hawk, reports everything back to the Earl. But the cook, old Mrs. Pemberton, she's got a kind heart, slips extra food to the Harrowfields when she can, treats Lady Eveline with the respect a lady deserves. There's a few others like her, people who hate what's happening but feel powerless to stop it." Adrian filed this information away, already seeing how it might be useful. Internal allies, even reluctant ones, could prove invaluable during a rescue attempt. "Tell me about the grounds. What surrounds the manor? How are the approaches monitored?" William moved to a clear patch of dirt floor and began sketching with a stick, creating a rough map that grew more detailed as he spoke. The manor sits on a small rise, gives it a view of the surrounding land. To the north there's open moorland, nowhere to hide for at least half a mile. East side has the formal gardens, all hedges and gravel paths, very exposed. South is where the main drive approaches from the road, lined with trees but still visible from the house. West is your best option, Your Grace. There's an old orchard there, mostly abandoned, trees grown wild. Beyond that, a stream cuts through the property. The guards don't patrol the orchard much, especially at night. Too dark, too tangled, and they figure no one would approach from that direction because of the stream. Can the stream be forded? Adrian asked, studying the crude map with intense focus. Aye, sir, in several places. Water's not deep this time of year, maybe waist-high at worst. There's rocks you can use as stepping stones if you know where to look. I could show you if you're willing to wait until after my shift ends. Can't risk being missed at the manor or questions will be asked. Adrian glanced at Patterson, who gave a subtle nod of approval. We'll wait. In the meantime, tell me about the family's daily routine. When do they have the most freedom of movement? When are they most closely watched? William returned to his narrative, painting a picture of orchestrated isolation that made Adrian's heart ache for what Eveline and her parents endured daily. Breakfast was brought to their rooms at 8 each morning. Afterward, weather permitting, they were allowed to walk in the East Gardens for 1 hour, always under guard supervision. Lady Harrowfield rarely joined these excursions anymore, her health having deteriorated under the strain of captivity. Lord Harrowfield accompanied his daughter when he could manage it, but he too seemed diminished by circumstances, his spirit breaking under the weight of choices that had left him helpless to protect his family. Afternoons were spent in their rooms, or in a small sitting room the family was permitted to use together. Books were their primary entertainment, along with needlework for Lady Eveline, though William had noticed she often sat with her embroidery untouched, staring out windows at a world she could observe but not join. Dinner came at 7, again delivered to their rooms. By 9 o'clock the doors were locked and the family confined until morning. The Earl's next visit is expected day after tomorrow, William added, his voice dropping lower as if the very mention of Ravensmoor's name might summon the man. Word came yesterday by messenger. The guards have been preparing, cleaning weapons, discussing how they'll handle things when he arrives. There's talk that he means to force the issue this time, that he's tired of waiting for Lady Eveline's consent and plans to arrange a marriage by whatever means necessary. The words hit Adrian like a punch to the gut. Day after tomorrow. He had even less time than he had thought. Whatever plan he devised would need to be executed within the next 36 hours, before Ravensmoor's arrival made rescue exponentially more difficult. This marriage, Adrian said carefully, has Lady Eveline given any indication she might accept to protect her parents? William's expression grew troubled. She's weakening, Your Grace. I heard her arguing with her father 3 days past, voices carrying through an open window while I was working in the gardens below. She was saying she couldn't bear to watch them suffer anymore, that perhaps accepting the Earl's proposal was the only way to end their ordeal. Her father was begging her not to sacrifice herself, saying they would find another way. But what way is there? Ravensmoor holds all the power, all the leverage. She's running out of hope. The image of Eveline contemplating surrender to save her parents struck Adrian with visceral force. That was exactly the sort of selfless decision she would make, putting others before herself, even when it meant destroying her own future. He could see her doing it too, walking into that devil's bargain with her head held high and her heart breaking, convincing herself it was noble rather than tragic. She won't have to make that choice, Adrian said, and the steel in his voice made William's eyes widen. I will get her out of there before Ravensmoor arrives. You have my word on that. They spent another hour discussing details, the shift changes for guards, which windows in the manor might be accessible from the outside, where horses were kept, and how quickly they could be saddled, the location of the nearest village where friendly assistance might be found. William proved to be an excellent observer, his year at Greystone having taught him to notice patterns and vulnerabilities that more jaded servants would overlook. When the boy finally left to begin his work shift, Adrian pressed the full coin pouch into his hands, along with additional notes that would see William and his sister safely relocated far from Ravensmoor's reach. When this is over, Adrian instructed, take your sister and go to London. There's an address written on that paper. A boarding house owned by a woman who owes my family favors. She'll give you work and lodging while you get established. You've earned that and more." William clutched the payment like a lifeline, his eyes bright with gratitude and fear in equal measure. "Thank you, Your Grace. I hope you succeed. Lady Eveline deserves better than what life has dealt her. She deserves to be happy." "She will be," Adrian promised, though he knew such assurances were premature. First he had to reach her, then free her, then navigate whatever aftermath followed. But failure was not an option he would entertain. After William departed, Adrian and Patterson spent the remainder of the morning purchasing additional supplies and conducting their own reconnaissance of Greystone Manor from a distance. They approached from different directions, never close enough to alert the guards but near enough to verify William's descriptions. The manor indeed sat on elevated ground, its stone facade imposing and fortress-like. The west orchard was as described, wild and overgrown, providing excellent cover for anyone willing to navigate its thorny brambles and uneven ground. The stream that bordered the property ran fast and cold, fed by recent rains that had swollen its banks. Adrian tested several crossing points, finding stones that would support his weight and memorizing their positions for when darkness would make visibility difficult. This would be his route in, using nature's obstacles as allies rather than impediments. As afternoon shadows lengthened, they returned to the Broken Wheel and took a private parlor where they could plan without fear of being overheard. Adrian spread William's crude map on the table, augmenting it with his own observations and sketching potential approaches and escape routes. "We go tomorrow night," he decided, tapping the manor's west side with one finger. "Late, after the guards have been drinking and their attention has wandered. I'll cross the stream here, move through the orchard to the manor's west wall. William said there's a servant's entrance on that side, usually unlocked until midnight when the housekeeper makes her final rounds. If I can get inside before then, I can reach the second floor and the family's rooms." Patterson studied the plan with a critical eye. "And once you're inside, the guards may be less attentive at night, but they're still present. You'll need to move silently through a building you've never seen, locate Lady Eveline's specific room among 3 possibilities, and extract her without raising alarm. That's assuming the doors aren't locked, which William said they would be." "I can pick locks," Adrian replied calmly. "It's not a skill most dukes advertise, but my military service taught me useful tricks. As for moving silently, I've done it before in circumstances far more dangerous than a guarded manor house. The biggest risk is whether Eveline will trust me immediately or think I'm some new threat Ravensmore has devised." "Perhaps a token," Patterson suggested. "Something only you and she would recognize, a way to prove your identity before she has time to react with alarm." Adrian considered this, then reached beneath his shirt to remove a chain he wore constantly, hidden from view but always present against his skin. Suspended from it was a small pendant, a silver bird in flight that Eveline had given him during one of their secret meetings. She had saved for months to purchase it, she had told him, wanting him to have something that represented freedom and hope. He had sworn never to remove it, and he had kept that promise even when he believed her lost to him forever. "This," he said quietly, holding the pendant up to catch the light. "She'll recognize it immediately. It will prove I'm who I claim to be and that I never forgot her." Patterson nodded approval. That should work. Now, what about her parents? Attempting to rescue all 3 simultaneously increases complexity and risk exponentially. It was the question Adrian had been wrestling with since learning the full scope of the situation. His every instinct screamed to save them all, to deny Ravensmore even partial victory. But pragmatism warred with emotion. 3 people moving through a guarded manor and across difficult terrain had far less chance of success than 1 person traveling quickly and quietly. "I get Eveline out first," he decided, though the words tasted like ash. "Once she's safe, we have leverage to negotiate for her parents' release. Ravensmore's entire scheme depends on forcing Eveline into marriage. Without access to her, his power over the Harrowfields diminishes. We can threaten to expose his methods publicly, ruin his political ambitions, and tie him up in legal challenges that would make keeping 2 hostages more trouble than it's worth." "He might harm them in retaliation," Patterson pointed out quietly. "He might," Adrian acknowledged, the possibility making him feel physically ill. But he's ultimately a pragmatist. Murdering peers of the realm would destroy him, bring down investigations and scrutiny he can't afford. If Eveline is beyond his reach and we've made clear we'll fight him publicly, his best option is to cut his losses and release the Harrowfields with some face-saving story about a misunderstanding or resolved debt. It's not perfect, but it's the most realistic path to saving all three of them. They spent the evening refining details, discussing contingencies for various scenarios that might unfold. What if the guards detected Adrian's approach? What if Eveline's room was locked and he couldn't pick it quickly enough? What if she refused to leave without her parents? Each possibility required planning, alternative routes, backup strategies that acknowledged the fundamental uncertainty of what they were attempting. As night fell fully, and the inn's common room filled with locals seeking warmth and company, Adrian retreated to his room and tried to rest. Sleep proved elusive, his mind replaying memories of Eveline while simultaneously imagining tomorrow night's rescue attempt in vivid detail. He saw himself crossing the cold stream, moving through the twisted orchard, slipping through the servants' entrance into Greystone's shadowed corridors. He saw himself finding her room, picking the lock with hands steadier than they felt now, revealing himself to her shocked gaze. Would she embrace him immediately or doubt his presence? Would she trust him enough to flee into the night, or hesitate out of concern for her parents? These questions without answers haunted him until exhaustion finally pulled him into fitful sleep, punctuated by dreams that mixed memory and anxiety into surreal tableaus. Morning arrived with leaden skies that promised rain before nightfall. Adrian welcomed the forecast. Rain would provide additional cover, muffle sounds, and make the guards even more reluctant to patrol thoroughly. He spent the day in careful preparation, checking his weapons, reviewing the plan with Patterson until every step was memorized, and composing letters to be delivered if he failed to return. His solicitor would know how to proceed, what strings to pull, which authorities to contact. The letters detailed everything: Ravensmoor's conspiracy, the Harrowfields' imprisonment, Thomas Webb's brave warning. If Adrian fell, at least the truth would survive him. William found them in late afternoon, arriving on the pretext of delivering oats to the inn stables, but actually bringing final intelligence. "The Earl's arrival is confirmed for tomorrow afternoon," he reported in a rushed whisper. "Messenger came this morning with exact timing. The guards are already preparing, setting up his usual rooms, laying in extra wine and food. He'll bring 8 men with him, maybe more. Your Grace, if you're going to act, tonight is your only chance." "Tonight it is," Adrian confirmed, feeling the weight of the commitment settle over him like armor. "Thank you, William. You've done more than anyone had the right to ask. Make sure you and your sister leave tomorrow, early, before Ravensmoor arrives and questions start being asked." The boy nodded and vanished back to his duties, leaving Adrian and Patterson to face the slow crawl of remaining daylight hours. They took an early dinner in their room, substantial food that would provide energy for the night ahead, but not so heavy as to slow reflexes. Adrian cleaned and loaded his pistols, checked the knives concealed in his boots, and dressed in dark clothing that would blend with shadows. At 10 o'clock, with rain beginning to fall in cold sheets that turned the world into a blur of grey and black, they set out for Greystone Manor. Patterson would remain at the stream's edge with horses, ready to flee at the first sign of Adrian's return. If Adrian had not emerged by dawn, Patterson was to ride for London with the letters and set in motion the plan to expose Ravensmoor publicly. It was a grim arrangement, acknowledging that failure might mean death, but both men understood the stakes required contingencies for every outcome. The ride to Greystone took less than an hour, though Adrian's heightened awareness made each minute stretch into eternity. They left the horses in a small copse of trees near the stream, their coats already soaked and their breath forming clouds in the frigid air. Patterson gripped Adrian's shoulder briefly, a gesture that conveyed everything words could not, then retreated into the shadows to wait. Adrian approached the stream alone, rain drumming against his coat and turning the ground beneath his feet into sucking mud. The water was even higher than it had been during his afternoon reconnaissance, the current stronger and more treacherous. He waded in carefully, gasping at the cold that immediately soaked through his boots and breeches. The stepping stones he had memorized were slick with rain and moss, requiring intense focus to navigate without falling. Halfway across, his foot slipped, and he plunged into water up to his chest, the shock of it stealing his breath and making his heart hammer wildly. He regained his footing and pushed forward, dragging himself up the opposite bank with fingers that had already started going numb. The orchard loomed ahead, a maze of gnarled branches and thorny undergrowth that tore at his clothing as he pressed through. Rain had reduced visibility to mere feet, which worked in his favor, but also meant he navigated partly by touch and memory, trusting William's descriptions and his own afternoon observations. 20 minutes of careful progress brought him to the orchard's edge, where it gave way to a narrow strip of unkempt lawn before the manor's west wall. He crouched in the deepest shadows, studying the building for signs of guard presence. A light burned in a ground-floor window, probably the kitchen where servants were cleaning up from dinner. Another light showed on the second floor, east wing, the family's area. Was Eveline awake in her locked room, perhaps staring out at this very storm and thinking thoughts he could only guess at? The servants' entrance was exactly where William had indicated, a plain door beneath a small portico that provided minimal shelter from the rain. Adrian sprinted across the exposed lawn, his footsteps muffled by wet grass and the storm's ambient noise. He reached the door and tested the handle with breath held and heart pounding. It turned. The door swung inward on hinges that needed oiling, the sound seeming impossibly loud despite being barely audible beneath the rain's assault. Adrian slipped inside and eased the door closed behind him, finding himself in a narrow corridor that smelled of damp stone and old cooking grease. To his right, the passage led toward the kitchen where voices murmured quietly. To his left, it opened into darkness that William had said would lead to a servant's staircase accessing the upper floors. He moved left, every sense straining for warning of danger. His hand found the staircase railing and he began climbing, testing each step before committing his weight, avoiding the creaks that might betray his presence. The stairs seemed endless, each landing an eternity. But finally he emerged onto the second floor into a corridor, dimly lit by a single lamp burning on a side table. This was the moment of greatest vulnerability. If a guard patrolled this hallway now, if a servant emerged from one of the rooms, if he had miscalculated the location of Eveline's chamber, everything would unravel immediately. He pressed himself against the wall and listened, hearing nothing but his own breathing and the muffled drum of rain against windows. The east wing lay to his right. He moved along the corridor with a burglar's stealth, checking each door for the locks William had described. The first two rooms showed no exterior locks, servants' quarters or storage. The third door had a heavy lock mounted prominently, and beyond it, Adrian heard the faint sound of coughing. Lady Harrowfield, if William's information was accurate. The fourth door also bore a lock, and from within came the sound of someone pacing. Lord Harrowfield, perhaps, unable to sleep while imprisoned in his own supposed sanctuary. The fifth door stopped him cold. It had the same exterior lock, but something about it called to him with certainty that defied logic. This was Eveline's room. He knew it with the same inexplicable sureness with which he had known he loved her the first time their eyes met across a crowded ballroom. His hand moved to the lock, fingers extracting the picks he had carried in an inner pocket, tools that had remained dry despite his soaking. Picking locks required patience and a delicate touch, qualities that warred with his urgency and the adrenaline singing through his veins. He forced himself to breathe slowly, to feel each tumbler's resistance and yield, to work methodically despite every instinct screaming to simply break down the door. Minutes passed like hours while he manipulated the mechanism, sweat mixing with rainwater on his face, until finally he felt the lock give way with a soft click that sounded like a gunshot in the silent corridor. He eased the door open and slipped inside, closing it quietly behind him, before allowing himself to look at the room's occupant. Eveline sat at a window seat, her back to him, staring out at the storm-lashed night. She wore a simple white nightgown and a shawl wrapped around her shoulders, her dark hair loose and falling past her shoulders, in waves he remembered running his fingers through during stolen moments. She had not heard him enter, so lost was she in whatever thoughts occupied minds trapped in impossible circumstances. "Eveline," he whispered, his voice barely audible even in the room's quiet. She went absolutely still, not turning as if afraid movement might shatter whatever dream or delusion had just spoken her name in a voice she could not possibly be hearing. When she finally did turn, slowly, her face was pale in the dim light from a single candle, her eyes wide with disbelief, and something that might have been fear or hope or both tangled together inextricably. "You're not real," she breathed, one hand rising to her throat as if to still a heart he could see pounding beneath her nightgown. "I've imagined you so many times that now my mind is simply providing what I cannot have." Adrian stepped closer, moving into the candlelight, and pulled the silver pendant from beneath his soaked shirt. He held it out, letting it catch the flame's flicker. "I'm real, Eveline. I came for you. I received Thomas Webb's letter 3 days ago, and I've been riding north ever since. I never forgot you. I never stopped looking. And I'm not leaving here without you." She stared at the pendant, recognition dawning in her expression, followed by emotions too complex and intense to name. Her hand moved toward him, trembling, stopping just short of touching as if still unable to fully believe. When her fingers finally made contact with his rain-soaked coat, feeling the solid reality of him, something in her expression crumbled and reformed simultaneously. "Adrian," she whispered, and the way she spoke his name held a year's worth of grief and longing and desperate hope. "How did you find me? How did you know? They told me you had moved on, that you believed I had married someone else, that you had forgotten me entirely." He closed the distance between them and took her hands in his, feeling how cold her fingers were despite the room's warmth. "Everything they told you was lies, designed to break your spirit. I never believed their rumors, but I couldn't find you until Thomas Webb risked his life to send me the truth. Ravensmore orchestrated your family's disappearance, manufactured debts, and has been holding you here against your will. I know everything, Eveline, and I'm going to end this tonight." Tears spilled down her cheeks, though she made no sound of crying. "My parents will be freed once you're safe," Adrian promised, pulling her against his chest and feeling her shudder with suppressed sobs. "Ravensmore's power over them depends on having access to you. Once we remove that leverage, we can force his hand. But we must leave now before the guards make their rounds, before anyone discovers I'm here." She pulled back enough to look up at him, her face showing the ravages of months of captivity and stress, but still beautiful to him, still exactly as he remembered in dreams and waking memories. "He was going to force me to marry him," she said quietly. "He arrives tomorrow with a magistrate in his pocket, who would oversee a ceremony whether I consented or not. I had decided that tonight would be my last night of freedom, before I surrendered to save my parents from further suffering." The words confirmed William's intelligence and made Adrian's grip on her tighten reflexively. "You're not surrendering to anyone. You're coming with me right now, and we're riding until we're beyond Ravensmore's reach. Then we're going to destroy him legally, publicly, in ways that ensure he can never threaten your family again. But first we need to move. Can you dress quickly? We have to cross difficult terrain in the dark and rain." She nodded, already moving toward a wardrobe to pull out riding clothes. "Turn around," she instructed with a ghost of the spirit he remembered, and despite everything, he found himself smiling at her insistence on propriety, even during a midnight escape. He faced the door, listening for sounds in the corridor while she changed, his mind already racing ahead to the challenges of getting her out of the manor and across the grounds to where Patterson waited. "I'm ready," she said after mere minutes, appearing at his side in a dark riding habit that would blend with shadows, her hair hastily braided and pinned. She had grabbed a small bag into which she had stuffed what he assumed were critical personal items and perhaps mementos too precious to leave behind. "Lead the way." Adrian took her hand and eased the door open, checking the corridor in both directions. Still empty, still quiet except for the storm's continuous assault on the building's windows. They moved together toward the servant's staircase, his body positioned to shield her if anyone appeared, her grip on his hand tight enough to hurt, but welcome, as proof of her solid presence beside him. They had nearly reached the staircase when footsteps echoed from below, heavy boots on stone stairs, someone ascending toward their floor. Adrian pulled Eveline into a shadowed alcove, pressing them both against the wall, his hand moving to the pistol concealed beneath his coat. The footsteps grew closer, accompanied now by off-key whistling, a guard making his rounds and clearly not expecting to encounter anything unusual. The man emerged onto their floor, a large figure with a rifle slung over his shoulder and a lantern swinging from one hand. He paused at the corridor's junction, holding the lantern high and peering into shadows, so close that Adrian could see the pockmarks on his face and smell the alcohol on his breath, even from several feet away. Eveline had stopped breathing entirely, her face pressed against Adrian's chest, and he could feel her heart hammering against his ribs. If the guard took 3 more steps in their direction, discovery was inevitable. If he looked more carefully into their alcove, if his lantern's light penetrated far enough, if he heard even the slightest sound, everything ended here. The man stood there for an eternity that probably measured only seconds, scratching his beard and yawning widely. Then he turned and walked away down the corridor, his footsteps receding toward the family's wing, probably checking that the doors remained locked as they were supposed to be. Adrian waited until the footsteps had faded completely before moving, pulling Eveline toward the staircase and descending as quickly as stealth allowed. The ground floor presented new challenges, more corridors, more potential encounters, the kitchen still occupied by servants finishing their duties. He navigated by instinct and William's descriptions, taking them through a maze of service passages until finally they reached the western door through which he had entered. The rain had intensified, if anything. The night beyond the door a wall of water and wind that would soak them immediately, but also provide perfect cover. Adrian paused at the threshold, looking down at Eveline. "Once we're outside, we run for the orchard. The ground will be treacherous and visibility is almost zero. Stay close to me and trust that I know where I'm going." "I trust you," she said simply, and the absolute faith in those 3 words nearly undid him. They plunged into the storm together, rain hitting them like a physical force, cold and relentless and cleansing. Adrian kept Eveline's hand clasped in his as they ran across the lawn toward the orchard's dark mass, expecting at any moment to hear shouts of alarm or the crack of gunfire. But they reached the trees without incident, crashing into undergrowth that tore at their clothes and skin, but welcomed them into concealing shadows. Navigation through the orchard was harder with Eveline, the paths he had memorized more difficult to follow when responsible for another person's safety. Branches whipped at them, roots threatened to trip them, and the rain turned the ground into a slippery nightmare that made every step treacherous. But they pushed forward, driven by desperation and hope in equal measure, until finally they burst through the orchard's far edge and confronted the swollen stream. The crossing point Adrian had used now looked far more dangerous with Eveline to consider. The water had risen further, the current stronger, the stepping stones submerged beneath rushing water. But there was no alternative route and no time to search for one. "The water will be deep and very cold," he warned her. "Hold on to me and don't let go no matter what happens. We'll cross together." She nodded, her teeth already chattering from cold and wet, and wrapped her arms around his waist. He waded into the stream, feeling the current immediately try to sweep his legs out from under him. The bottom was uneven, full of holes and rocks that turned ankles and threatened balance. Halfway across, Eveline stumbled and would have fallen if not for his grip on her, the water briefly rising to her shoulders and making her gasp with shock. "Almost there," he encouraged, pulling her forward through sheer determination. Just a few more steps. They reached the opposite bank and collapsed briefly in the mud, both gasping for breath, before Adrian hauled them upright again. "We can't stop. We need to reach the horses and put distance between us and Greystone before they discover you're gone." Patterson materialized from the shadows where he had been waiting, his face showing relief at Adrian's return. He helped Eveline onto one of the horses, wrapping her in a dry cloak he had kept protected, while Adrian mounted Zeus with muscles that protested every movement. "Ride hard," Adrian instructed, gathering his reins. "We need to make the next village before dawn breaks. Once we're there, we can rest and regroup, but for now, speed matters more than comfort." They rode through what remained of the night, pushing the horses as fast as safety allowed on rain-slicked roads, putting precious miles between themselves and Greystone Manor. Eveline rode like the accomplished horsewoman she was, despite exhaustion and cold, never complaining, never asking to slow down. She simply kept pace, trusting Adrian to lead them to safety. Dawn was breaking in shades of grey and silver when they finally reached a village large enough to have a coaching inn. Adrian secured rooms without providing real names, paid extra for discretion and immediate service, and saw Eveline settled before the fire in a private parlour before he allowed himself to believe they had actually succeeded. She was safe. She was free. She was sitting mere feet away from him, no longer a memory or a dream, but solid and real and his again. "What happens now?" she asked quietly, holding her hands toward the fire's warmth and not looking at him. "Now we get you somewhere completely safe," Adrian replied, joining her by the fire. "Then we plan how to free your parents and destroy Ravensmoor's ability to hurt anyone ever again. But first, we rest. You're exhausted, and we both need to recover before making further decisions." She turned to look at him then, her eyes reflecting firelight and emotions too complex to untangle. "You came for me," she said, as if still processing the reality. "After all this time through everything, you actually came." "Did you doubt I would if I had known where you were?" he asked gently. "I doubted everything," she admitted, tears threatening again. "I doubted your love was real, doubted my own worth, doubted we would ever see each other again. Ravensmoor took everything from me, freedom, dignity, hope. But somehow you found me anyway." Adrian reached out and cupped her face in his hands, thumbs brushing away tears that had started falling despite her efforts to contain them. "He took nothing that can't be restored, Eveline. Your freedom is yours again. Your dignity was never actually his to steal. And hope, we're going to rebuild that together, along with the future we planned before this nightmare interrupted it." She leaned into his touch, eyes closing, and whispered, "I love you. I never stopped loving you, not for a single day." "I know," he replied softly. "I never stopped loving you either, and now nothing will separate us again. I promise you that." They sat together in the firelight as the inn awakened around them, two people who had been torn apart by machinations and lies, but who had found their way back to each other through determination and an unshakable connection. The journey was not over. Ravensmoor still threatened, her parents still needed rescue, and society would have opinions about everything that had transpired. But in that moment, none of it mattered as much as the simple fact of her hand in his and the knowledge that they had reclaimed what was rightfully theirs. The future stretched ahead uncertain and challenging, but they would face it together, and that made all the difference. The inn's private parlour had become their sanctuary, as morning light filtered through rain-streaked windows, transforming the storm's violence into something softer, almost peaceful. Adrian watched Eveline sleep in the chair closest to the fire, her head tilted at an angle that would leave her neck sore when she woke, exhaustion having finally claimed her mid-conversation. He had draped an additional blanket over her shoulders and now stood guard, unable to rest himself despite bone-deep weariness that made his limbs feel weighted with lead. Patterson had taken rooms across the hall and was presumably sleeping, though Adrian suspected his valet was equally alert to potential danger. Ravensmoor would discover Eveline's absence within hours if he had not already, and his response would be swift and merciless. The Earl had invested too much in his scheme to simply accept defeat. He would send men to search, would likely guess Adrian's involvement once he learned of the Duke's presence in the area, and would do everything in his considerable power to reclaim what he considered his property. The thought made Adrian's hands curl into fists. Eveline was not property. She was a woman of intelligence and spirit who had been systematically degraded by a man who viewed people as chess pieces to be moved according to his ambitions. That Ravensmoor had come so close to succeeding, had brought Eveline to the brink of surrendering herself to save her parents, filled Adrian with a rage that burned cold and calculating rather than hot and reckless. He needed a strategy that went beyond simple flight. Running would only delay the inevitable confrontation, and it would leave Lord and Lady Harrowfield still trapped at Greystone Manor, still subject to Ravensmoor's retaliation. No, what was required now was not retreat, but attack, a comprehensive dismantling of the Earl's carefully constructed web of lies and coercion that would leave him powerless to threaten anyone ever again. Adrian moved to the writing desk in the corner and began drafting letters, his hand steady despite fatigue. The first went to his solicitor in London, instructing him to begin legal proceedings immediately. Ravensmoor's manufactured debts would not withstand scrutiny from competent lawyers armed with the truth. The forged documents, the threats, the illegal imprisonment, All of it could be documented and presented to authorities who were not in the Earl's pocket. It would take time, but justice ground slowly and thoroughly when properly motivated. The second letter went to an old military friend who now served in the Home Office, a man who owed Adrian his life after a particularly brutal engagement in Spain. Adrian detailed everything he had learned about Ravensmoor's activities, not just the Harrowfield situation, but also the rumors of corruption, exploitation of workers, and abuse of power that had surfaced during his journey north. Men like the Earl rarely confined their cruelty to a single target. There would be other victims, other families destroyed by his machinations, and bringing them to light would strengthen the case against him. The third letter was the most delicate. He addressed it to his mother, the Dowager Duchess, knowing she would be furious about his hasty departure and worried about the scandal that would inevitably follow. But he also knew she possessed political connections that rivaled his own, relationships cultivated over decades that could be activated in support of a cause she deemed worthy. He explained the situation with brutal honesty, holding nothing back about Eveline's imprisonment or his intentions regarding their future. His mother might disapprove of the circumstances, but she would not tolerate injustice, particularly not against a young woman of good family who had been victimized by an ambitious peer. "You're planning something," Eveline's voice came from behind him, still rough with sleep but alert. "I can see it in the way you're writing those letters, all focused intensity and determination." Adrian turned to find her awake and watching him, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, but her eyes clear despite the shadows beneath them. "I'm planning how to free your parents and ensure Ravensmoor can never threaten your family again. Running was necessary to get you to safety, but it's not a permanent solution. We need to remove the threat at its source." She rose and moved to join him at the desk, looking down at the letters he had been composing. "You're going after him legally, building a case that will destroy his credibility and power." "Among other things," Adrian confirmed. "Legal action will take time, but it's necessary for a lasting resolution. However, I'm also planning something more immediate. Ravensmoor is expecting to arrive at Greystone Manor this afternoon to find you still captive and your resistance worn down to nothing. Instead, he's going to discover you vanished, and that I'm responsible. His rage will make him careless, and careless men make mistakes." Eveline's expression grew troubled. "You're planning to confront him directly." "Adrian, he's dangerous. He has men who will kill on his orders without hesitation. If you face him openly—" "I won't be facing him alone," Adrian interrupted gently. "I have resources he doesn't know about, allies he hasn't accounted for, and most importantly I have the truth, which is a weapon he can't counter no matter how many hired thugs he employs. But yes, there will be a confrontation. It's unavoidable. He won't simply let this go, and your parents remain in his custody. We need to force a resolution quickly before he has time to move them or make their situation worse." She was quiet for a long moment, processing his words and their implications. When she spoke again, her voice carried a steel he remembered from before her captivity, the strength that had drawn him to her initially. "Then I'm coming with you. They're my parents, my family. I won't hide in safety while you risk yourself to save them." "Absolutely not," Adrian said firmly. "You've just escaped from months of imprisonment. You're exhausted, traumatized, and you're the one person Ravensmoor most wants to recapture. Bringing you anywhere near Greystone Manor would be what? Dangerous? Everything about this situation is dangerous, Adrian, but I'm not a porcelain doll to be hidden away while the men handle everything. I know Greystone's layout better than you do. I know the guards' routines, their weaknesses. I know which servants might help us and which are loyal to Ravensmoor. You need that information if you're going to succeed." Her arguments made practical sense, even as they made his heart clench with fear for her safety. The thought of her anywhere near that place, near that man, filled him with protective instincts that demanded he refuse absolutely. But he also recognized the woman before him was not asking his permission. She was informing him of her intention, and short of physically restraining her, he could not prevent her involvement. "If you come," he said slowly, each word carefully chosen, "you stay back from any direct confrontation. You provide information and guidance, but you do not put yourself in a position where Ravensmoor or his men can reach you. Can you agree to that?" I can agree to be cautious and strategic, Eveline replied, which was not quite the same thing but was probably the best compromise he would obtain. When do we leave? Not for several hours yet. You need rest, real rest in a proper bed and food. We both do. Ravensmoor won't reach Greystone until afternoon, which gives us time to prepare properly. Patterson is arranging for additional horses and supplies. I've sent word to Thomas Webb to gather any servants at the manor who might be sympathetic to our cause, and I'm waiting for responses to messages I sent last night to local magistrates who are not in Ravensmoor's pocket. Eveline moved closer, her hand finding his arm and gripping it with surprising strength. You've thought of everything. You've been planning this since you received Thomas's letter, haven't you? Not just the rescue, but the entire campaign to destroy Ravensmoor's power. I've been planning since the moment I understood what he did to you, Adrian admitted. Men like him operate in shadows, using fear and secrecy as weapons. The solution is to drag everything into sunlight, to make his crimes too public and too documented to ignore. He's made enemies during his rise to power, men he's cheated, families he's exploited, rivals he's undermined. Once the truth starts coming out, they'll all emerge to add their testimony. It will be like watching a dam break. She leaned against him, her exhaustion evident in the way her weight settled against his side. I spent so many months feeling helpless, watching my parents deteriorate under the strain, knowing that every day brought me closer to having to surrender to him. I had nightmares about the wedding he was planning, about becoming his wife and having to endure his presence for the rest of my life. The things he said to me when my parents couldn't hear, the way he looked at me like I was something he'd purchased rather than a person. Her voice trailed off, and Adrian felt her shudder. He wrapped his arms around her, holding her close and wishing he could reach back through time to prevent everything she had suffered. He'll never touch you again. I swear that on everything I hold sacred. And when this is over, when your parents are safe and Ravensmoor is ruined, we're going to rebuild everything he tried to destroy. Your family's reputation, your security, your future. All of it. Our future, she corrected softly. Unless you've changed your mind about wanting to marry a woman who comes with such complicated baggage and scandal attached to her name. Adrian pulled back enough to look at her directly, cupping her face in his hands. Eveline Harrowfield, I have wanted to marry you since the third time we spoke, when you argued with me about parliamentary reform and made me realize I'd never met anyone who challenged and delighted me in equal measure. Nothing that has happened changes that. If anything, watching your strength through impossible circumstances has only deepened my admiration and love. So yes, when this is finished and you've had time to recover from what you've endured, I'm going to ask you properly to be my wife, and I'm going to hope very much that you say yes. Tears were sliding down her cheeks again, but she was smiling through them. I'll say yes. I would have said yes a year ago if you'd asked. I'll say yes today if you ask now. I'll say yes every day for the rest of our lives, Adrian, because loving you is the one thing that kept me sane during those months at Greystone. Knowing that somewhere you existed, that what we shared had been real, gave me something to hold on to when everything else was being stripped away. He kissed her then, a gentle connection that spoke of promises and commitment and futures that would be built together despite all obstacles. When they finally separated, both were crying and smiling simultaneously, the kind of emotional overflow that comes from surviving nightmares and finding hope on the other side. Come, Adrian said, leading her toward the door. Let's get you properly fed and rested. Then we'll finish this together. The next few hours passed in a blur of practical preparation, interspersed with moments of quiet connection. Eveline ate the first real meal she had enjoyed in months, discovering that captivity had dulled her appetite, but freedom was rapidly restoring it. She bathed and changed into fresh clothing that Patterson had somehow procured, emerging looking more like herself than she had since Adrian found her. The haunted quality in her eyes remained, trauma that would take time to heal, but the spark of her essential spirit was returning. Patterson reported that word from the manor confirmed Ravensmoor's impending arrival and the chaos that had erupted upon discovery of Eveline's escape. Guards were being disciplined, servants questioned, and the Earl's fury was reportedly spectacular. Good. An angry man made mistakes, and Adrian was counting on Ravensmoor's rage to override his usual caution. By early afternoon they were mounted and riding back toward Greystone Manor, taking a different route that would bring them to the village of Ashwick, rather than the manor itself. Adrian had received responses from 2 local magistrates who were willing to at least hear accusations against Ravensmoor, men whose jurisdiction the Earl had not yet fully corrupted. They were waiting at Ashwick's small courthouse, along with Thomas Webb and 3 other servants from Greystone, who were prepared to testify about what they had witnessed. The village was larger than Adrian had expected, prosperous enough to have proper civic buildings, and a population that had not yet been completely cowed by Ravensmoor's influence. The courthouse was a sturdy stone structure that spoke of local pride and tradition, and the 2 magistrates waiting inside looked like men who took their responsibilities seriously. Sir Richard Thornbury was the elder of the 2, a retired military officer whose ramrod posture and shrewd eyes suggested he was not easily fooled or intimidated. The younger magistrate, Mr. Edmund Price, was a local solicitor who had taken on judicial duties as part of his civic obligations. Both men rose as Adrian, Eveline and Patterson entered, their expressions carefully neutral but attentive. "Your Grace," Sir Richard greeted Adrian with a slight bow. "Your message suggested a matter of some urgency and serious criminal allegations. We are prepared to hear what you have to say, though I must warn you that accusing a peer of the realm is not something to be undertaken lightly." "I'm aware of the gravity, Sir Richard," Adrian replied calmly, "but I have evidence and witnesses that will demonstrate beyond reasonable doubt that the Earl of Ravensmoor has engaged in systematic criminal activity, including fraud, extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. This is Lady Eveline Harrowfield, one of his victims, who can provide direct testimony about her family's ordeal." Both magistrates' eyes moved to Eveline, taking in her appearance and the shadows her ordeal had left on her face. Sir Richard's expression softened slightly, with what might have been sympathy or anger or both. "Lady Eveline, please sit. If what the Duke suggests is true, you've been through a terrible experience. We will hear your account, and we will investigate thoroughly. You have my word on that." What followed was several hours of detailed testimony. Eveline described her family's situation with a composure that Adrian found remarkable given everything she had endured. She detailed the manufactured debts, the threats that had forced her family to flee London, the conditions of their imprisonment at Greystone Manor, and Ravensmoor's increasing pressure for her to accept a forced marriage. Her account was clear, specific, and devastating in its implications. Thomas Webb and the other servants corroborated her testimony, adding details about guard rotations, locked doors, and overheard conversations that painted a picture of systematic captivity. One maid described finding Lady Harrowfield weeping in her locked room after Ravensmoor had visited, his threats having reduced the woman to despair. Another servant, a young man who worked in the stables, testified about being ordered to prevent the Harrowfields from leaving the grounds by force if necessary. Adrian presented the letters he had received, including Thomas Webb's original warning and communications from his solicitor, documenting the investigation into Ravensmoor's financial dealings. Forged documents were being uncovered, debts that existed only on paper, and a pattern of coercion that extended beyond the Harrowfield family to other victims who had been too frightened to speak out. By the time testimony concluded, both magistrates looked grim. Sir Richard leaned back in his chair and steepled his fingers, his expression thoughtful. "This is deeply troubling. If even half of what we've heard today is accurate, the Earl of Ravensmoor has committed crimes that warrant immediate arrest and prosecution. However, he is currently a peer of the realm with significant influence. Moving against him requires careful coordination with higher authorities to ensure the legal process is followed correctly." "With respect, Sir Richard," Adrian said quietly, "Lord and Lady Harrowfield remain imprisoned at Greystone Manor at this moment. Every hour we delay is another hour they suffer under Ravensmoor's control. I'm not suggesting we act rashly, but we cannot afford excessive caution while victims are still in immediate danger." "What are you proposing, Your Grace?" Mr. Price asked, speaking for the first time in nearly an hour. "I propose we ride to Greystone Manor now with your authority as magistrates, and demand the Harrowfields' release into your custody pending investigation. Ravensmoor has just arrived there, according to reports. He'll be off balance, angry about Lady Eveline's escape. If we confront him now with official authority and multiple witnesses, he'll have difficulty refusing without revealing the illegality of his actions. Once the Harrowfields are safe, you can pursue the full legal case against him with thoroughness and proper procedure. Sir Richard and Mr. Price exchanged long looks, some silent communication passing between them. Finally, Sir Richard nodded slowly. "It's irregular, but the circumstances are exceptional. If Lord and Lady Harrowfield are indeed being held against their will, we have authority to intervene immediately." "Very well, Your Grace. We'll accompany you to Greystone Manor and demand an audience with the Earl. If he refuses to produce the Harrowfields or attempts to prevent our investigation, that refusal itself becomes evidence of wrongdoing." They assembled a small party for the confrontation, the 2 magistrates, Adrian Patterson, and 4 constables who served Ashwick and surrounding villages. Eveline wanted to come, but Adrian convinced her to remain at the courthouse with Thomas Webb and the other servants. If things went badly at the manor, she needed to be positioned to flee and carry their testimony elsewhere. She agreed reluctantly, making him promise to bring her parents back safely. The ride to Greystone Manor took less than an hour, the party moving with purpose along roads that were still muddy from the previous night's storm. As they approached the estate, Adrian felt his pulse quicken with anticipation and controlled anger. This was the moment everything had been building toward, the confrontation that would determine whether justice could be achieved or whether Ravensmoor's power would prove insurmountable. The manor looked different in daylight, less forbidding but still imposing with its stone facade and elevated position. Guards were visible on the grounds, more than William had described, evidence that Ravensmoor had increased security after Eveline's escape. As the party rode up the main drive, several guards moved to intercept them, hands moving toward weapons. Sir Richard rode forward, his military bearing evident. "I am Sir Richard Thornbury, magistrate for this district, and this is Mr. Edmund Price, my colleague. We are here on official business to speak with the Earl of Ravensmoor. Stand aside." The guards looked uncertain, caught between their orders and the authority represented by the magistrates. After a tense moment, one of them hurried toward the manor's main entrance, while the others maintained their positions, watching the new arrivals with suspicious eyes. Minutes passed before the Earl of Ravensmoor himself emerged from the manor, flanked by more guards. Adrian had never met the man personally, though he had seen him at Parliament sessions and social events. Ravensmoor was in his late 40s, tall and distinguished-looking with silver threading through his dark hair, and the kind of polished appearance that came from wealth and careful grooming. But his eyes, Adrian noticed immediately, were cold and calculating. The eyes of a man who viewed the world as something to be manipulated for his benefit. Those eyes swept over the assembled party, lingering on Adrian with recognition and what might have been fury before settling on the magistrates. "Sir Richard, Mr. Price, this is unexpected. To what do I owe this visit?" "We have received serious allegations regarding your treatment of Lord and Lady Harrowfield, who we understand are currently residing on your property," Sir Richard stated formally. "We are here to investigate these allegations and to ensure the Harrowfields' welfare. We require an immediate audience with them." Ravensmoor's expression became carefully neutral, though Adrian saw the tension in his jaw. "The Harrowfields are my guests, Sir Richard. They remain here voluntarily, while we resolve certain financial matters between our families. I'm afraid they are indisposed at the moment and not receiving visitors." "That is unacceptable, my lord," Mr. Price interjected. "We are not visitors. We are magistrates conducting an official investigation into accusations of false imprisonment, extortion and fraud. You will produce Lord and Lady Harrowfield immediately, or we will be forced to conclude that you are preventing us from fulfilling our legal obligations." The Earl's composure cracked slightly, anger flashing across his features before being controlled. His eyes moved to Adrian again, and this time there was no mistaking the fury there. "I see the Duke of Ashbourne has been spreading lies about me. This is clearly a personal vendetta related to his pursuit of Lady Eveline, who I'm sure he's told you was being held against her will, despite the reality that she simply chose to avoid his unwanted attention. Lady Eveline is currently providing detailed testimony to support the allegations," Adrian said calmly, meeting Ravensmoor's glare without flinching. along with multiple servants from this estate who have witnessed the conditions under which the Harrowfields have been kept. Your fabrications are transparent, Ravensmore, and they're about to collapse completely. The only question is whether you compound your crimes by continuing to obstruct these magistrates, or whether you accept that your scheme has failed. For a moment, Adrian thought Ravensmore might order his guards to attack, consequences be damned. The Earl's hand moved toward his coat, as if reaching for a weapon, his face flushing with rage. But Sir Richard's voice cut through the tension like a blade. My lord, you will control yourself. Any violence against magistrates in the execution of their duties is itself a serious crime. I strongly suggest you cooperate. Now, for the final time, produce Lord and Lady Harrowfield immediately. The standoff stretched into uncomfortable silence, broken only by the sound of horses stamping and the wind rustling through nearby trees. Then, slowly, Ravensmore's shoulders sagged slightly in what might have been acceptance of defeat. Very well. They are in the manor's east wing. I'll have them brought down. We'll accompany you, Sir Richard stated firmly, to ensure there are no misunderstandings. They dismounted and entered the manor, Ravensmore leading the way with visible reluctance, while guards hovered uncertainly. The interior was as William had described, elegant but somehow cold, more museum than home. They climbed to the second floor and walked down corridors Adrian had navigated in darkness mere hours ago, finally stopping before the doors he recognized as leading to the Harrowfields' rooms. Ravensmore produced keys and unlocked the first door, revealing Lord Harrowfield sitting in a chair by the window, looking diminished and grey. The man's head jerked up at the sound of the door opening, and his expression cycled through confusion, fear, and finally desperate hope as he recognized the magistrates and Adrian behind them. Sir Richard, Mr. Price, I don't understand. Lord Harrowfield, we are here to investigate allegations that you and your family are being held at this estate against your will, Sir Richard explained gently. Can you confirm whether this is accurate? Lord Harrowfield's eyes filled with tears, his composure crumbling. Yes, God, yes, we've been prisoners here for nearly a year. Ravensmore fabricated debts we don't owe, threatened our family, forced us to flee London, and then kept us here through intimidation and violence. My daughter, where is my daughter? He was supposed to arrive today to force her into marriage. If he's hurt her. Lady Eveline is safe, Adrian interrupted quickly. She's in Ashwick under protection, unharmed. I got her out last night. The relief on Lord Harrowfield's face was profound, but it was immediately replaced by concern. My wife. You need to get my wife. She's been ill, her heart weakened by the stress. She needs medical attention and to be away from this place immediately. They moved to Lady Harrowfield's room, finding her in bed, pale and fragile-looking but conscious. When she saw them, she began weeping quietly, hands reaching out toward her husband who rushed to her side. The scene was heartbreaking in its demonstration of what captivity had done to this family, and Adrian saw both magistrates' expressions harden with anger at what they were witnessing. Lord and Lady Harrowfield, Sir Richard said formally, by the authority vested in me as a magistrate of this district, I am placing you under protective custody. You will be removed from this estate immediately and provided with appropriate accommodation and medical care while we investigate the circumstances that brought you here. My Lord Ravensmore, you are hereby ordered to surrender all documents related to the Harrowfield family's supposed debts and to refrain from any contact with them pending the outcome of this investigation. Ravensmore had been standing in the doorway, his face an expressionless mask, but now he spoke with barely controlled fury. This is outrageous. You have no authority to interfere in private financial arrangements between peers. Lord Harrowfield came here voluntarily to work off legitimate debts. If he's now changing his story, the only story that's changing is yours, Adrian interrupted coldly. And it's falling apart as we speak. My solicitors have examined your so-called documentation of debts. They're forgeries, poorly executed ones at that. You'll be facing criminal charges for fraud, extortion, false imprisonment, and conspiracy. I'd suggest you begin consulting with your own lawyers about how to minimize the damage, because your political career just ended. The mask finally shattered completely. Ravensmore lunged toward Adrian with a sound that was half snarl, half roar, his hand pulling a knife from his coat. Adrian was ready, sidestepping and delivering a punch that connected with the Earl's jaw and sent him staggering backward. The constables moved immediately to restrain Ravensmore, wrestling the knife away and forcing him against the wall despite his struggles. "You're finished, Ashbourne," Ravensmore spat, blood trickling from his split lip. "You think this changes anything? I have friends in Parliament, allies who will protect me. You've made a powerful enemy today." "No," Adrian replied quietly, his voice deadly calm. "I've destroyed a predator who victimized innocents because he thought his position made him untouchable. Your friends will abandon you the moment this becomes public, because no one wants to be associated with someone accused of the crimes you've committed. And as for enemies, you made me your enemy the moment you targeted Eveline. Everything that follows is simply consequence." Sir Richard was already issuing orders, sending constables to secure documents from Ravensmore's study, instructing others to help Lord and Lady Harrowfield prepare for departure. Within an hour, the Harrowfields were in a carriage heading back to Ashwick, Adrian riding alongside while Ravensmore remained under guard at the manor, pending formal arrest procedures. The reunion between Eveline and her parents at the Ashwick courthouse was emotional enough to bring tears to the eyes of hardened constables. Lady Harrowfield clung to her daughter as if afraid she might vanish again, while Lord Harrowfield kept touching Eveline's face as if to confirm she was real. They were together, they were safe, and the nightmare that had consumed their lives for nearly a year was finally ending. Over the following days, the full scope of Ravensmore's crimes began emerging. Other families came forward with their own stories of exploitation and coercion. Workers from his mines testified about dangerous conditions and withheld wages. Business partners revealed fraudulent dealings and broken contracts. What had seemed like an impregnable position of power dissolved like morning mist as witness after witness added testimony to the growing case against him. The scandal rocked London society when news reached the capital. Adrian's mother, true to form, had mobilized her considerable influence to ensure the story was told accurately rather than being twisted by Ravensmore's remaining allies. The Dowager Duchess made it clear that anyone who defended the Earl or questioned the Harrowfields' account would find themselves excluded from her social circle, which was enough to silence most potential critics. Ravensmore himself was formally arrested and transported to London to await trial. His fall from grace was spectacular and complete, the kind of public disgrace that would be discussed in drawing rooms for years to come. Adrian took no pleasure in the man's destruction, but he felt profound satisfaction knowing that justice was being served and that Ravensmore would never again have the power to hurt innocent people. 3 months later, on a crisp winter morning when frost painted the grounds of Ashbourne House in silver and white, Adrian stood in the estate's private chapel and watched Eveline walk down the aisle toward him. She wore cream silk that made her look like something from a dream, her dark hair arranged in an elegant style that still managed to have curls escaping in the way that always made him smile. Her father walked beside her, his health and spirit restored by freedom and his daughter's happiness, while her mother watched from the front pew with tears of joy streaming down her face. The wedding was small, attended only by close family and the friends who had stood by them through the scandal and its aftermath. Thomas Webb was there, having taken a position in Adrian's household after leaving Greystone forever. Patterson stood as witness, his usually stoic face showing rare emotion, and Adrian's mother occupied the place of honor, her initial disapproval having transformed into genuine affection for Eveline once she had seen how the young woman faced adversity with grace and courage. When Eveline reached the altar and took Adrian's hands, her smile was radiant and free of shadows for the first time since he had found her at Greystone. "Ready to make this official?" she whispered, just loud enough for him to hear. "I've been ready since the third time we spoke," he whispered back, making her laugh quietly. "Though the journey to get here was more complicated than I anticipated." "The best things usually are," she replied, as the vicar began the ceremony. The vows they exchanged were traditional, speaking of love and honor and commitment through all circumstances. But Adrian knew they carried additional weight for both of them, having been tested by separation and adversity before they had even spoken them. When he slipped the ring onto Eveline's finger, he was claiming not just a bride, but a partner who had proven herself stronger than any challenge they might face together. The celebration afterward was joyful and heartfelt, filled with toasts that grew increasingly sentimental as the evening progressed. Adrian's friends from his military days told embarrassing stories about his younger years, while Evelyn's relatives shared memories of her childhood. Lord Harrowfield gave a speech that had to be paused several times while he composed himself, expressing gratitude to Adrian for saving his family and welcoming him as a son. Lady Harrowfield simply embraced Adrian and whispered, "Thank you for bringing my daughter back to us." As midnight approached, Adrian and Evelyn slipped away from the festivities to walk in the frost-touched gardens, needing a moment of quiet together after the day's excitement. They moved slowly along paths lit by hanging lanterns, their breath forming clouds in the cold air, hands clasped and shoulders touching. "I keep thinking I'm going to wake up and discover this is a dream," Evelyn said softly, looking up at stars that blazed in the winter sky. "That I'm still trapped at Greystone, still counting down days until Ravensmoor forced me into a nightmare marriage. And all of this, your rescue, the trial, our wedding, was just my mind trying to escape reality." Adrian stopped walking and turned to face her, taking both her hands in his. "This is real, Evelyn. You're free, we're married, and we have our entire future ahead of us. Ravensmoor is in prison awaiting trial. Your parents are rebuilding their lives, and you never have to be afraid again." "I'm not afraid," she said, and the certainty in her voice made him believe her. "Not anymore. What happened changed me, Adrian. It showed me how dark the world can be, how easily circumstances can strip away everything you thought was secure. But it also showed me that love can survive anything, that people will risk themselves for others, that justice exists even when it seems impossibly distant. You taught me that. You and Thomas Webb and everyone who helped us." "You taught me something too," Adrian replied quietly. "You taught me that real strength isn't about never breaking. It's about enduring impossible circumstances and still finding reasons to hope, still maintaining your essential self, despite everything trying to crush it. You're the strongest person I know, Evelyn. That's one of the many reasons I love you." She rose on her toes to kiss him, a connection that spoke of promises kept and new chapters beginning. When they separated, both were smiling despite the cold that made their faces ache. "So what happens now?" Evelyn asked. "We're married, the scandal is fading, our families are secure. What do we do with our happily ever after?" "We live it," Adrian said simply. "We travel, if you'd like, see places neither of us has been. We manage the estates together, because you're brilliant with numbers and I suspect you'll revolutionize how things are run. We engage in politics and society on our own terms rather than society's terms. We support causes we believe in, help people who need it, and build a life that matters beyond just accumulating wealth and position." "That sounds perfect," Evelyn murmured, leaning against him. "Though I'd add one thing to the list." "What's that?" "We stay grateful for every single day, because we both know how easily this could have ended differently, how close we came to losing everything. I don't want to take any of it for granted. Not you, not our freedom, not the simple joy of being able to walk in a garden at midnight without locked doors or guards or fear." "Agreed," Adrian said, wrapping his arms around her as the wind picked up, carrying snow that had just begun falling. "We stay grateful, we stay vigilant against those who would abuse power, and we help others find their way out of darkness the way we found ours." They stood together as snow drifted down around them, two people who had been tested by circumstances and emerged stronger. The path behind them had been difficult, marked by separation and suffering and systematic cruelty. But they had survived it, overcome it, and transformed it into something that deepened rather than destroyed their connection. Inside Ashbourne House, the celebration continued with music and laughter floating through windows into the night air. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new responsibilities, and the ongoing work of healing from trauma. But tonight was for joy, for gratitude, for celebrating the victory of love over malice and hope over despair. Adrian looked down at Evelyn, snow catching in her hair and making her eyes shine, and felt his heart expand with an emotion too large for words. She was his wife now, his partner, the other half of himself that he had nearly lost but had fought to reclaim. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, armed with the knowledge that they could survive anything as long as they had each other. "I love you," he said, the words simple but carrying the weight of everything they had endured to reach this moment. "I love you too," Eveline replied, her smile brilliant despite the cold. "Thank you for crossing England in a storm to rescue me. Thank you for never giving up, never accepting the lies, never letting distance or circumstance diminish what we meant to each other. Always," Adrian promised, "in any circumstance, across any distance, against any obstacle, I will always find my way back to you. That's what love means, that's what we mean to each other." They turned back toward the house together, ready to rejoin their celebration and step forward into the life they had built from the ruins of attempted destruction. Behind them, their footprints marked the snow-covered garden path, evidence of their passage through darkness into light. The Duke of Ashbourne had thought he had lost Lady Eveline Harrowfield forever. Instead, a clandestine letter had set him on a desperate journey that ended not in tragedy but in triumph. They had reclaimed what had been stolen, defeated those who had tried to break them, and emerged with a love strengthened rather than weakened by adversity. And as they crossed the threshold back into warmth and joy, surrounded by people who loved them and had fought alongside them, both Adrian and Eveline knew that their greatest adventure was just beginning. Because happily ever after wasn't a destination, it was a journey they would walk together for all the days of their lives. Thank you so much for listening to this epic tale of love, courage, and redemption. If this story of the Duke's desperate rescue and Lady Eveline's triumph over adversity touched your heart, we would be absolutely delighted if you would subscribe to our channel for more romantic historical adventures. Please take a moment to leave a comment sharing your favorite part of the story. We truly treasure hearing from you. Don't forget to give us a thumbs up and activate your notifications so you never miss our next captivating romance. Your support means the world to us, and we can't wait to bring you more sweeping tales of passion and perseverance. Until next time, dear listeners, end echoes of romance.